Hello and welcome everybody to our first webinar of this SAP Around the Globe webinar series. It has been in our heads since a while, and I'm very happy that we have the pleasure to get this into life now. The goal of this is to have various streams of SAP research from around the world coming together in this webinar series. So today we have a great kickoff. We have Annemarie Davis and Charmaine Williamson from South Africa who will talk about the ontologies of SAP from a South African perspective. Before we start, I give you a quick overview of what is going to happen. So in the next hour, we will briefly hear from Annemarie some information about what is going on in South Africa, and then we can enjoy, in a way, Charmaine's presentation. We will take around 40 minutes, and then we have, as promised, some space for Q&A in the end of the session. So, whom are we talking with today? Annemarie is a professor in strategic management at the University of South Africa, and she leads the SAP research focus area there at their university and serves also as a global rep at large at the SMS. She's a qualitative researcher with a focus on micro-strategizing and practices and activities, and has some interest in organizational change and middle management. And then we have Charmaine, who guides us through the presentation later. She's a research fellow also at the University of South Africa. She serves as an academic advisor at different universities around higher degrees candidates and advises them in the field of academic arguments, writing, theory, methods, particularly qualitative methods. But she also worked with non-for-profits on good governance, fundraising, and so on. And she has an appointment at the Business School of the Netherlands in international management. I hope that I covered everything. Otherwise, you just jump in and tell us a little bit more about yourself. Thank you very much for coming and for sharing your ideas and thoughts with us. And I'm very looking forward to the next hour that we can spend together.
Thank you very much, Melina. Charmaine, I'll let you do the uploading of our presentation. Good afternoon, everybody. And Melina, thank you very much for this invitation and for this opportunity. I'm smiling because I'm looking at the number of participants and I'm recognizing the names. And I almost feel emotional because what I'll be sharing with you in the next two slides, most of you have had a role to play in that whole timeline and process. So my role today is really just to introduce you to the developments of strategist practice in South Africa, take you through the timeline, and then I'm handing over to Charmaine, who will be taking us through the presentation. So the story of strategy as practice in Africa, 2008, Charmaine, we can go to the timeline. 2008, our colleague who's also in the session, Piet Venter, he had visited with the Open University UK, had engagements with Alex Wright, and this is after Human Relations Special Edition in 2007. And I think that's almost where UNISA and South Africa got a first mover advantage on the strategist practice approach in 2008. We then moved forward, did a few engagements, and 2010 saw the first publication from African authors affiliated to the University of Pretoria. That was the first article published in strategist practice, and that was by Marit and Pretorius. Following from there, we had further engagements in 2013, 2014. I know Marie van Rensburg is in the session. We started a research focus area at the University of South Africa, recruiting masters and doctorate students. But at the same time, we also introduced a chapter on strategist practice in a prescribed book for postgraduate students, and then the following year for undergraduate students. So, and those two books are the most widely prescribed books within the South African universities. 2017, 2019, lots of activities in terms of collaboration. Charmaine played an amazing role in terms of representing our interest at the AOM in Atlanta in 2017, at Addis Ababa in Ethiopia in 2018, and then in 2019, she also represented us in Chicago. At the same time, we were featured in the Strategizing Activities and Practice and SMS Practice interest group newsletters. I know Charmaine has got an excerpt from that in her presentation. We also, at that point, hosted Jastrzebkowski and Whittington. UCT and University of Stellenbosch hosted Jastrzebkowski, and UNISA, through the influence of Dr. Karen Stander, hosted Richard Whittington. Through this whole process, Charmaine has played an amazing role as a reviewer for the conferences, and she's received multiple recognitions for her reviews. And then, obviously, as we started moving forward with our master's and doctorate students, many of those graduates are in this session. We continued with those activities. So that's around about what we did in the first 10 years with our first mover advantage. Moving on. We found ourselves 2023, Chantal Govender, Dr. Chantal, she represented us at the AOM in Boston. Also, Emerging Researcher Scholar Program there. And Amkela Ngwenya was a master's graduate from Strategist Practice at UNISA, and he was accepted at Warwick University for his PhD. 2024, we had the AFAM conference. I know Natasha is in the session, also working with the University of Stellenbosch Business School, as well as Warwick University, started a South-North dialogue in terms of practice-oriented studies. At that time, Charmaine and I were approached to write the entry on strategy as practice in Africa for the encyclopedia, and that encyclopedia is due to be released later in November this year. Where we are now, 2025, for the first time, we had 3 papers and from Africa at the Organization Studies Workshop in Crete. We're part of this global series today. Thank you for being here. Charmaine or Milena already mentioned, I was elected as the global rep at large for the Strategy Practice Interest Group for the Strategic Management Society. And that's given me the opportunity to work towards building a database of strategy as practice scholars, researchers, and postgraduate students. We already have a database of 111 scholars on the African continent. If you know of anybody else, please let's build that community. We also celebrate Catherine Leroux from the University of Pretoria, who is part of the Mentee program, which is through Strategic Management Society at the AOM. And then Charmaine, Piet, and myself did an integrative review, and we identified 29 papers in accredited journals using the strategy as practice perspective with authors affiliated to institutions in Africa. I see Olof is also in the session, and he published a paper with his students from Ethiopia, also looking at strategy as practice in Africa. Then the biggest celebration for me is when we look at our master's and doctorate students, and most of them are in this session. To date, at the University of South Africa, we have had 7 PhD studies completed, 1 more going in for examination soon that is using the strategy as practice perspective, and 14 of our students have graduated with full research master's degrees at UNISA using the strategy as practice perspective. So that was my idea of, and my role for today is really to share with you the journey that we're on and confirming that we are here to stay and we are certainly moving forward and we're taking it further in terms of where we are going. And I absolutely hope to see you at SMS next year in Berlin, but not just there, also in other engagements as well as in webinar sessions. Thank you, Milena and Charmaine. I have said what I wanted to say. I now hand over to Charmaine.
Thank you so much, Annemarie, and lovely to share a sense of community, I think, and I hope the idea of community and communalism and communitarianism is one of the strengths that carries us for the afternoon. We really would like to acknowledge all of those who have given up your time to join us from various parts of the world in various time zones. Of course, we are delighted that we have such a strong representation from South Africa, And we hope that they will see this pretty much as a panel discussion when we get to the Q&A section, so that we are able to celebrate what you see on the slide in front of you still as we linger and enjoy the developments that have happened to this theoretical field, based really so much on collegial relationships, on the power of networking, on the ability of just doing follow-ups. And Annemarie and I were reflecting earlier, and we were just saying, if you had to actually put a budget to what we have achieved, our budget would be so modest. And so much of what you see is a result of volunteerism. It's a result of people giving freely of their time. It's a result of just the spirit of being impassioned and inspired by a particular theoretical field that I think we as South Africans and Africans have long felt that we wanted it coming. I think I'd give away my age to say that I won't quite say I remember the first edition of the Harvard Business Review, which was in 1922. That would be somewhat of an exaggeration, despite my very white hair. But it was one of my prescribed readings when Professor Piet Venter, who's with us this afternoon, and we often call him the father of strategy as practice in South Africa. I won't call him grandfather. He might just object to that. And I will never forget reading that Harvard Business Review as a pre-doctoral candidate and looking at the whole notion of business science and thinking, but where are the humans in all of this? Where are these situated, embedded ideas around how we come into existence and how we construct and co-create knowledge? And so it's an incredibly affirming moment for me to be able to be associated with South Africa and Africa in terms of an ontological, epistemological, methodological, axiological, philosophical. Sorry, I just want to move on. So clearly those were just a few opening remarks. I'll just wait a minute because my connection is unstable. Welcome to South Africa. And just to say again, thank you to the organizers for the invitation. Of course, with any kind of science or any kind of research we do, we want to do excellent data management. We want to declare our antecedents of our research. So I have a somewhat heavy slide there, but actually ends up being a bit lighthearted when one looks at the idea that even with the idea of looking at which YouTube I'm using or which photographs I'm representing ontologies and South Africa through, that we do have to declare the management of ontology, even with regard to the ethical requirements. So good data management, something that we're increasingly working on in Africa, despite the fact that we often might have research management officers for universities representing thousands of students, and we might perhaps have 2 research managers there. So whatever way and we can, we acknowledge the ethics and the conventions of good data management in terms of going forward. So I really want to welcome you to this session on ontology with just some thoughts on ontology. And I mean, if you actually look at it from this perspective, you're going pretty much, wow. And you're thinking, I think Charmaine thought this was another kind of webinar. But seriously, what we're intending to do this afternoon is really focus on the kind of social science, humanitarian, philosophical approach to ontology, and certainly not when it comes to data management and technological speak. But I must admit, in preparing for this afternoon, I was absolutely fascinated to realize how much of our AI and how much of our data management systems, as we increasingly move into these platform-based approaches, how much of them is driven by just the notion and the concept of ontological language and digital language and the different orders and logics that go together with ontology. So I hope you could add to that discussion from whichever discipline you come in, although I think I would be safe in assuming that most of us are from management science, and most of us with a real commitment to strategy and strategy as management. So I really want to start by telling you that I'm pretty much a fan of Catherine Perry. She's one of our continental representatives, very much involved in digital marketing in terms of building the image of the continent. And there's a wonderful YouTube, which is a little bit older now, but one that I would definitely recommend. Again, just to see where does the coming into being and the coming into existence, how does that get portrayed by Africa, which after all is definitely not a homogeneous continent. We even debate the number of countries we have. And so when you watch this YouTube, she really is talking about the notion of how we have this made for Africa myth, and it can go from scholarship and the kind of positions you occupy or the kind of positions you assume for scholarship around Africa. It can go as far as products that are supplied to Africa. It can go as far as health services. It can go as far as the whole notion of supporting the development or the entrepreneurship or the business imperative of Africa. But there's a line at 8:19 and 8:20 minutes where Catherine talks about the fact that, we need to tell our stories as Africans. And she gives a little side laugh and says, Africans telling their stories, how much time do you have? And so I hope you do have some time, because really that's the thread that I want to follow in terms of African ontology. So with an initial story, as Annemarie quite correctly highlighted, is that we were able to celebrate the fact that strategy as practice was going around the globe, really at a time in 2018 where we got together as an editorial team for the Strategizing Activities and Practices AOM interest group. And there I worked with Catherine Dietrich, who was, I think, on her way out as the editor, and Violetta was coming in. And I said, is there any kind of volunteer work that I can do for the newsletter? And so as a result of that, I had the pleasure and the insider track of what it felt like to work sort of in breaking the news around strategy as practice before it was published in any kind of journals. But I think the thing I remember the most was being an advocate and saying, why don't we have a strategy around the globe standard item in the newsletter? And I'm incredibly delighted to see that this afternoon we're actually making it into a strategy as practice, embodied practice, and not just something that is simply going to remain in a two-dimensional or digital or a textual manner. So we covered South Africa, I think, in that inaugural strategy as practice around the globe. I don't think it was out of any kind of subjectivity. I think it was just that we did a call, and I think we were obviously in a position to know that it was coming up, so we could put something together in typical newsletter deadline in time. And then just to encourage Colombia, to encourage India, which followed. And as we say today, we have a similar trajectory for this webinar series. But what we also decided to do is not only feature South Africa, because I think South Africa has a real sensitivity, it has an understanding, it has a nuanced position based on the fact that it does often punch above its weight globally, if you just simply look at the BRICS grouping that we belong to. And so we also felt quite strongly that we should cover the African Academy of Management. And so we were, again, proactively ready to see what was going to happen at the Academy of Management, which was in Addis Ababa, and which we were delighted had a strategic management track, which also, I think, for the first time ever, accommodated strategy as practice. And I think many of us know Cecilia. She is now Dr. Cecilia, and was supervised by Richard. And as a result of that, Cecilia, I think, was involved in really unpacking how one could shift perspectives from a classic or a foundational aspect of strategic management and strategy, and moving it towards strategy as practice through her paper on smart strategy and just the whole almost foreshadowing of the open strategy that we now see as part of our repertoire. And I still remember attending that session and the grappling that the track was doing with, so what do you actually mean by strategy as practice? And there were three of us, Cecilia, colleague, Dr. Kassa Voldenbet, who was at De Montfort University, and myself, and we were able to lead a bit of an informal panel, which once again puts the whole ontological way in which we be on this continent on the map. So to turn from that story of the back end, the trajectory, the historical developments that have led up today, and really to move into the subject of the day, which when Annemarie and Melina contacted me and said, would you do ontology? I sort of said, only if I can do it from really a wider angle. And so those of you who perhaps want a purist version of ontology, we'd love to hear the debate after the presentation. But for those of you who embracing the idea of how we conjure life in South Africa from scholarship and an ontological and philosophical tradition, you're in the right place. So welcome then to our conjuring of life in terms of strategy as practice ontology in South Africa. The term conjuring life is not my nomenclature. It is from a beautiful anthology of poetry, a wonderful and inspiring poet known as a slam poet, which is, again, just the kind of language and the formations of identity that we are beginning to see in terms of the continent and how digital and activism is really taking root. And the quotation from her poem, which is incidentally, and of course is promised, called Storytelling, is, as the quote says, they will say she was always telling stories. They will not know she was conjuring life. And I think when it comes to ontology, when we delve into that, we are thinking, so where did this come from? Where were the roots? What are these antecedents? Why do we, as social scientists, humanities, as qualitative scientists, as is often pointed out to us, why do we go to the lengths we do to clarify what are our assumptions as we go further into a study? And that's really because we're co-creating, we are conjuring, we are forming, we are shaping, and we are crafting. And so I think it's no coincidence that we can allow a wonderful young woman poet from from South Africa to suggest things that are more wider spread than the pure philosophical take on ontology. I'd like you also, just while you are pondering this slide, to look at the full cover of the book. I just wanted to juxtapose both images, the image of amnesia and that wonderful dialectic of conjuring life and yet at a collective amnesia. And then also the incredibly provocative image that comes with the cover of the full book. But let's get back to some core ideas about ontology. And again, we talk about conjuring life, and we as South Africans and Africans acknowledge that critical decisions, deep conversations, marriages, funerals, life events are very often arranged under the shade of a tree. And in fact, to go so far as to say that Africa has the tree of life, which is called the baobab tree, as you can see pictured there. But that analogy is not unique to us in terms of using generative nature, in terms of using the metaphors of energy, of growth, of development. And so when we look at the research methodology tree and acknowledge the work of Easterby, Smith, Thorpe et al., we see there that for them, ontology represents the root of building knowledge, of declaring knowledge and bringing knowledge into existence, the how, the actual notion of what is this knowledge, how is it constituted, where did it come from, and how and what kind of knowledge is created, and then the methods, the value systems, and then the wrapping up criteria of the rhetoric that goes with the scholarship. So I was very interested to see Easterby Smith position it in two ways. And again, that in itself is an ontological commentary of the roots of the tree depicted in the image on the left, and then the cross section of the trunk of the tree, where ontology is placed right there at that sweet core of where the tree is. And so immediately when we're dealing with our own research, particularly for me, who's always doing the kind of advising that goes with the research process, the talk through of, so what actually does it mean to speak to ontology? Images like this become very helpful. And then the translation of those images into South African analogies or African-based analogies, again, creates that resonance, that sense of meaning, that connection with the research. So based on thinking that through then, is ontology at root level? Is it at the sweet core? Let's just take a more serious look at ontology in terms of its meaning for this afternoon, as opposed to the data language and the technological version of ontology, which if you understood it, I'd love to have a conversation with you at some stage. But yes, obviously a philosophical term, been around since the 1600s. What I loved about the definition in this particular paper was the idea of pulling into that kind of monistic, that almost, I never know the word, I never know whether to say pure science, exact science, the so-called hard sciences, the natural sciences, that uses the term that ontology is our generalized chemistry of reality, which shows the forms and substance as well as the mix. Obviously, if we have to reinvent that using another term or another image, wait around. Let's see where that can go to. So, of course, in having this conversation, we talk about the coming into existence, the state of being, the foundational components of it, the interactions of it, deal with that which is abstract, but then also we deal with that which is concrete, which perhaps explains why when I was having a conversation with one of those so-called exact sciences, she said, I can't believe that you declare all these assumptions. We just say we do in science and we unpack our method. So for the ontological position, that idea of just simply being concrete about it is a comfortable space to be in. But ontology would also represent an ideal, a dream, and I hope that part of my storytelling also represents the dream of scholarship for the future, and particularly for Africa, the real, the imaginary, and something that I'll spend a little bit more time on, and that is the whole idea of cosmology. And then, of course, those interrelationships that we are increasingly being challenged with, you know, so ontologically, what does it mean to be human in what I term this eco-techno dimension? Where does humanness now belong, and where does intelligence, where's intelligence ontologically invested? And I was intrigued, although when we go to the roots and the sweet spot in the middle of the trunk, to find out that it was considered the first philosophy, and it is that which brings about or populates reality. And I'd like to pick up this idea of first by now bringing it very close to South Africa, as close as East Africa, where we have to contemplate not only for social sciences, humanities, not only for all the research agendas that have collectively gathered in this room today, but certainly for where South Africa and Africa is going in terms of paleontology, which is a leading field, and certainly in terms of what does it mean both to be African and to be global, or what does it mean to be a world citizen or a citizen of Eswatini or Ethiopia or Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. So I've been very privileged to be able to go to Ethiopia many, many times, and I've always felt a resonance and a connection with its claim as being the cradle of humankind. You know, that Lucy was definitely one of the first, those who defined humanists. And I was incredibly privileged to see Lucy in the museum at Addis Ababa, which means, of course, the flower. But also those of you who are intrigued by the idea of architecture and tourism, you discover in these wonderful rock-hewn churches in the north of the north of Ethiopia in the Tigray region. And these churches were believed ontologically to have been built in a very limited time, and that they were built overnight. And simply because of their manifestation of existence in such a rapid time, when they are hewn out of pure rock, must obviously mean that there was angels involved. So whether we believe that the first existences follow the track of Lucy, or whether we think about the angels who are building the rock-hewn churches that we found in the beautiful town of Lalibela, it's still a critical ontological question for our continent. And as I said, moving even closer to home, we realized that not only is it about where and when and what, but it's about who and which country on the continent may lay claim to that first existence. So there's a tension, there's a toing and froing, there's a heated debate. The first human as whatever we conceive that to be. So this was a very close neighbor to me in my home in Johannesburg, a place called the Stadfontein. There's a series of caves. There's a series of underground tunnels that are spoken about with great reverence. And there's an entire scene of grassland and buildings and human inhabitants and wonderful tourist spots that is known as the cradle of humankind. And as you can see, South Africa has laid its claim, it's textually created its ontological determination that this is the cradle of humankind, this is the World Heritage Site, and that in this area, in our country, this is where first human appeared. This is where first humans sort of crafting of the soil and the land effects and the farm be found. But at the same time, Africans always declared this communalism. And so there's this very proud assertion that we are also one. So I'm not going to try and resolve that debate, but I believe that is a very important conversation going forward. And even though we might be studying, you know, the best of management science for 2025 and going forward, South Africans and Africans will still be determining, exploring, and questioning, you know, so where do we root this? How do we root this knowledge of our management or strategy as practice? So I just thought it might be useful just to sum up what the intellectual argument is at the moment and to dwell a little bit about the toing and froing that's happening between East Africa and South Africa. So declared quite proudly, as you saw in that image, was the single cradle model. And, you know, so there is one cradle of humankind, and it's in Swartkorp, Stadfontein, Kromdraai in South Africa. It's now a challenge theory. Simultaneous to our claim, we had the claim of Lucy in Ethiopia, and we also had a claim in Kenya. So the richest hominin site is still considered to be in South Africa, but certainly the age of how far back we go has been seriously brought into question. So East Africa is saying that their sites both predate as well as some sites coincide with South Africa. And as a result of that, we have moved away from an ontological construction of a single cradle of humankind, and we've moved into this multiple cradle model. So watch this space, and this tends to be what's been published currently about the current position around hominid origins and where the story begins. So we have a 2023 paper, and then we also have more recently, not yet a paper, but certainly in popular science, we have a groundbreaking study that challenges the long-held view of the cradle of humankind's ancient environments. And this is coming out of one of our universities, the Universities of Cape Town, but equally, as many of you will remember, and I remember very fondly, we have the University of Witwatersrand's paleontology studies, we have Guy Berger, we have the whole idea of Astrophylicus Naledi, where such was the claim that this burial site and the whole notion of grieving and mourning and burying one's dead could be established through the site of Naledi, which is found in the Swartkorps and Sterkfontein area. So once again, we have this rootedness about, so at what stage did we bury our dead? Which country, which space, which place, and how can we claim to bury our dead while we conjure scholarly life and scientific life using either the single model or, as I want to put on the table, the multiple model. So I'm really not going to go through this slide in a great deal of detail. I have used ChatGPT in order to just say, so how do I make an ontological point about questioning the cradle of humankind in South Africa, given the current challenges to South Africa's biochronical age of Mrs. Place, who turned out to be a Mr. Place, and our group of hominids. And I found it intriguing. I arranged it in terms of the macro and meta level for Africa. So what does it mean to be human, and where the story begins in terms of origins and identity? But very much, as I've been suggesting thus far, what does it mean for existential positioning in the global narratives of human evolution? And where does Africa or specific countries in Africa stand as being the birthplace of humanity? And then obviously it's important to look at it because we've welcomed you to South Africa this afternoon, and looking at the ontology for South Africa and realizing that as science moves forward, as it moves wider and deeper, we have this notion of the fragility of origins claim. And, where does that leave South Africa on a whole lot of levels? Where does it leave us as far as our ecotourism, our paleontology studies are concerned, our group of scientists, our own meaning as we construct our meaning as communities and individuals in Africa? It's also about embracing this multiplicity of beginnings. And I must admit, I found that the whole idea of seeing multiple cradles just sat better with me. And I thought, that's why you were longing for a strategy as practice when you read that 1922 Harvard Business Review article. And then, of course, ontological positions are always political positions. And so there will be that activist struggle, there will be that political struggle of whose version of being human is legitimized. And then naturally, and also important from a strategy as practice point of view, where we've got used to tracking both the micro temporal realities and trying to draw those up into those meta or macro temporal swaths of time, so where does it shift our age backwards or forward? Does it alter the chronology? And so much as we're thinking about how do we situate ourselves in deep technology, how do we situate ourselves in deep time? And again, while these might not be management issues per se, it has very much to do with we as researchers and the management of things like ecotourism, the management of things like the informality and formality of our economies, the management of things like the so-called legitimized way of doing business and the so-called shadow way of doing business. So again, using ChatGPT, I thought, well, it'd be very interesting because I always have, with students, when I start to read their work, I start to see a very kind of smoothed over, very slick tale, what I call almost advertorial language. And so I then invariably will do a quick text and say, paragraph 3 on page 17 looks a little bit interesting. Did you perhaps use some ideas from ChatGPT or your current AI? So this is what it did. I did put in some ideas. But nevertheless, what I'd like to use is to just use this idea of that I've put in bold as saying there is a resonance here in terms of how we define and encapsulate and conceptualize around strategy as practice, that it's layered and fluid and speaks to contested ideas of strategy. That we can acknowledge the convergence of multiple histories, organizationally, business-wise, that multiple identities are acknowledged as being strategic beings. And of course, the wonderful Feltman article that came out in 2011, which was Strategy as Practice from a Narrative Perspective. And I've left out another author, just forgive me for that. And what I loved as well is just this idea that we don't have inert backdrops. And for me, that was like an aha moment from a strategy as practice point of view. Is it's so tempting when we have research methods and when we work with our students who say, but I've completed my 17 interviews, and this idea of those interviews being an inert statement of the meaning of their research title or their research question, and seeing their research as unfolding both theoretically in strategy as practice, open strategy, their versions of the theories that they bring into being. And then also just the idea of pluralism and the dynamism and the idea of continuously having to negotiate. So what constitutes the strategy, and can we conceive of a formalized future where they're not just multiple cradles, but that we have a series of what we used to call the old-fashioned strategic plan coexisting as multiple strategic plans. And certainly we have that in the lived reality, and that has been a privilege as well as the uncomfortable space that strategy as practice scholars have to negotiate and discuss in their consulting lives or their scholarly lives. But of course, as I said, with ChatGPT, you have this somewhat idealized reality, and looking at ontology from a strategy as practice perspective in South Africa means having to deal with really hard and uncomfortable conversations, despite the fact that we saw liberation in 1994, we saw our claim to legitimacy being founded deeply in 1994. South Africans claim exceptionalism, and the one area where that exceptionalism is claimed is in that very unique and oppressive version of looking back over our past. And so this wonderful idea of clawing back is expressed by Deborah James. The book is about to be launched, and it speaks to something very close to strategy as practice and many of our studies, which is how people creatively piece together their wages. They probably pierce it as well. Wages, welfares, and debt to claim what they are owed. This provocative exploration urges us to radically rethink distribution, highlighting the informal and everyday strategies that people use to secure a fairer share in an increasingly and dramatically unequal world. And then juxtaposed to that was this, what I considered a somewhat ironical, almost innocent statement. I was just scouring for ideas similar to Deborah James's. And then I came across this idea of our own National Planning Commission. And most of the time, I'm much more of a public sector strategy as practice interested scholar than a private sector. And so I thought, well, this is interesting if we look at what our National Planning Commission is doing. And I was intrigued to find that there was this concept of drawing so much from international literature. So no real surprises there. You know, let's do some benchmarking as far as our strategic planning process is concerned. You can see the classic ideas of short, medium, and long term. But again, what intrigued me was the silence on African ways of strategy. So we can see there that North America and Europe, even in our own Development Bank of Southern Africa and in our own Planning Commission, that we have, if I was a psychologist or a psychological scholar, I would say we have a slip of the tongue, a textual slip of the tongue here. So I think by now you've realized that the premise that I'm putting on the table is that belonging to South Africa, being a South African researcher, being a South African supervisor, being a South Africa teacher, being a South Africa engaged scholar, was very few of us have the luxury simply to be a singular researcher in the current massification and the current redress and social justice ways of being. And so pluralist ontologies is, for me, the only way in which I can make any sense of any kind of management study or any kind of way forward. We have this wonderful thing in South Africa that when a meeting ends, it always seems to end with the saying, "What's the way forward?" And pluralist ontologies is for me an expression of what it means as the way forward. And I know I'm not citing a South African scholar here, but I'm a fan of Feyerabend. And so I thought at one point, until I discovered Patuma's wonderful poem, I thought that I would call this presentation on flea bites, love affairs, and entire galaxies. But then I thought I really want to bring in the ontological voice of a woman that coexists in the same land and works very hard to reshape and rethink how we exist as women and how we exist as women in relation to men and the many transgenders that we would be looking at in this land of South Africa. And so thinking about this idea, we, those of you who might have been at EGOST in Milan will know that one of the positions as a pluralist, it was to work with Annemarie and Piet and postulate an African niche range to add to the existing niche breadth that our National Planning Commission, that kind of scholarship that they're using from the North Americas and Europe, but we saw as being in the strategy as practice space. And as Annemarie claimed, 29 papers now, which might be a modest contribution, but which for us represents a niche range space. So the paper was presented at the EGOS conference in Milan. I don't know who took this photograph. It might well have been Melina. And so they said we were at the crossroads using the niche range to expand the niche breadth. And so I thought, well, if we're talking strategy as practice ontology and we're talking the foundational niche, in what we identified as 9 overview papers, now 10 overview papers, what then was a statement of our foundational scholars in strategy as practice from an ontological point of view. And I was actually quite surprised to see that there were, of 10 papers, there were multiple references to ontology, but only 3 papers in what we call the so-called overview papers, which we have in our Hania paper, as well as in the Milan paper. And so no surprises here in terms of the colleagues whom you see presented. And so these were the deliberate ontological views expressed by what we have termed in that paper the foundational space. So I'm not going to go into the quotes that our colleagues have used, but certainly the views from the center, from the foundational ecology, is about the ontological debate and concern about micro-isolationism, the idea of strategy as practice, but strategy as process, something that has been an ontological argument for some time, coexisting with the micro-isolationism, which for me is always summed up in Montera's statement about one day we'll be writing about flipping hamburgers. And then that really useful paper that many of us have gone back to by Seidel and Whittington on the tall and flat ontologies, obviously a very direct addressing of the views from the foundational, and to continue again in the taller and flatter ontologies. And then from Keir and McKay is the whole idea of the post-processual strategy as practice. This paper I remember with great resonance, because I remember seeking something like this idea of dwelling and embeddedness and the being in the world, the ability to inhabit strategy when I was doing my own doctoral study. And so this paper was for me, as one of our strategy as practice scholars who's with us today, Dr. Nadine Demetz, this became one of my golden papers. And then this delightful statement, also again by Keir and McKay, which is that strategy as practice as strategy making on the spot and in the twinkle of an eye. So, you know, I often have these very serious discussions because I work across multiple disciplines, multiple universities. So I might be on one day dealing with a student of theology, the next day I might be dealing with a student in engineering. And very often if I start to talk about, you know, what is my discipline or what is my theoretical orientation, and I perhaps suggest that I set store by a strategic world that could be made on the spot and in the twinkle of an eye, I very often get like a shake of a head and a lifted eyebrow. But as South Africans, and so we've seen the view from the foundational ecology. So what is the South African position? And that is that we want to say that context matters. And I think I'm speaking to an audience that is really converted. But of course, we have to delve into that to say context matters at a national level, or context matters at a majority world or minority world matter. And so in our organizational study workshop paper, where we talk about bringing Africa in, which is a Zuga statement, we write about those nuances situated in the African context that warrant a review of the philosophical underpinnings. And so currently, in terms of where that body of work, where we juxtapose in the 29 papers next to the 10 overview papers, we found the Kotamaki framework of crossing strategies useful. Our papers quite strongly declare nexus of other theoretical traditions in conjunction with SAP. So ontologically, we are thinking in terms of these multiple ontologies. You can see some of the theoretical positions there. But nevertheless, we have found that South Africans are playing it safe, we're not playing it state. Other people rather play it state. But our state of being is really that we are relying currently on safe frameworks. And just to give you an example of this from two main bodies of work that make the point, which includes then additional bodies, is I think that there's a great opportunity that we are not harnessing as South Africans at the moment in terms of the informal economy. So Ghana, studies in Ghana by Darby and Knott, and then there is another one as well by Darby and Coffey, a broader-based overview paper which uses informal economy as a case within a broader ontological and epistemological position. But we have real opportunity in the informal economy. Interestingly enough, we have, like any nation on earth, we have uncomfortable spaces that, for want of a better idea or concept, I would call shadow economies. Other people would call them, I work in Nigeria, sometimes people call it the facilitation. And I'm saying, what is facilitation? And they say, well, you know, what is corruption? So let's just see my ontological take on shadow economies. And then, of course, we've got the formal economy, and South Africa's mining economy is definitely one of those that puts us on the book. But in a study by Grebe, Davis, and Odendaal, which is one of our 29 papers, we see that the opportunity to claim any kind of informal economy or any kind of shadow economy has not happened. And that's no indictment against those scholars. It's just that is to demonstrate what opportunities lie ahead of us. What is exciting about the paper is it starts to build in this whole idea of tension and hybridity. But for instance, in our shadow economies, we have miners that go into disused mines and they mine for the deep, deep, deep gold that isn't financially useful to get out through formal economy anymore. And they call the zama-zamas. We have in South Africa, in our construction industry, what we call the construction mafia. As in many countries around the world, we have money laundering, and we're not seeing that come up in our SAP studies. Here's another example, again, this one around higher education, which I thought would bring us all together. I think those concepts are well understood. So the next idea that I wanted to come through was the linguistic diversity and Africa's metaphorical ways. And there, drawing from the center, we have the Rouleau paper of 2013, how Rouleau identifies metaphors. But what I want to put on the table is that Africa comes with this rich basket of metaphors, probably the most well-known being that of Ubuntu. And as you can see from this map, the linguistic diversity, even of the word Ubuntu, let alone how that linguistic construction captures the ontological existence in these different countries, makes a statement in of itself. So again, this is a really interesting website that you can visit, which speaks to the Ubuntu philosophy that goes from family to community to society to environment, and then to that cosmology and that spirituality that I spoke about earlier. And then I love this idea is there's a misconception that African philosophy is one name, Ubuntu, because if you just simply look at the graphic, we can see how many constructions of the word exists in the hugely diverse linguistic variety that we have on the continent, and which each predisposes its ontological orientation. We also obviously love our wildlife, and many management scientists, still not strategy as practice, are using wildlife as an ontological heuristic. The earliest work, and an absolutely intriguing piece of work, I would heartily recommend it as a seminal text on consciousness and the state of being, is Eugene Maria's White Ant. Ironically, Clem Sunter, whom we claim very proudly as one of our leading management gurus, chose The Mind of a Fox. And then ironically, we have the American Margaret Morford choosing The Courage of the Lion. And then this is the kind of stuff we get in a lot of strategic planning sessions. I've used the example of Andre Dietrichs, an associate. He's there on the web. You can see his web address. And these analogies of either using bees or lions or the wild dog in order to speak to the kind of management conventions and mores that are happening in our corporates, in our public sector, and in our organization. And here is just a summary of perhaps what we would definitively state represents that which we want to lay claim to, knowing that others lay claim to it as well within the widespread idea of First Nations and the reclaiming of indigenous spaces. But the oral tradition, communalism I mentioned in the opening, spirituality, that cosmology and the holism. And I just want to suggest a whole lot of metaphors here that tie in with strategy as practice, that tie in with those four central concepts. I just think this is the most beautiful image of the different fabrics of the different countries of Africa and just what those fabrics mean, Tretwe being the South African one. Metaphors continue, and then just some examples of current management studies that have tapped into those metaphor spaces, but which do not see in strategy as practice in either. I'll skip this next version. It was really just saying that in the work that I do with widespread scholars across the continent and with my own students across South Africa is that from an ontology and reasoning point of view, this is pretty much how I would say how our seminal reasoning, our deep reasoning would work when you work with communities, when you work across the diversity and the inclusion that is South Africa. This is a fantastic paper speaking much more about retroductive and abductive reasoning, which I think is an area that, again, taking this multiple ontologies and pluralism, that we have to move beyond the sort of classic inductive, deductive way of reasoning and move into abduction and retroduction. And then one of our scholars, sadly not in strategy as practice, but we want to see if we can get some co-publishing, where he speaks about the fact that there's a dearth of critical management studies in South Africa, and we are playing it safe. And is it worthwhile us going out there on a limb? So I invite you to read his article. And then, of course, methodologically, we can't talk ontology. I haven't done much on the epistemological bit, but I think it's mainstreamed and woven in. But of course, the qualitative methodological assumptions that we would make in studying Africa, South Africa, strategy as practice, would be very much around the qualitative methodologies pictured here, the idea maybe of portraiture and pastiche added, the idea of photo voice. These are images from Ethiopia when I spent my time there and was inspired to write the idea of how daily lived practice of women in these doctoral studies program that were predominated by men, how these women actually felt in terms of their situated strategy in order to obtain their PhDs. So my tentative conclusions is that, as you no doubt have seen, very colorful, sound and energy that we were able to conjure up in terms of the domains of study, to be mindful of the metaphors, but not to be seduced by the romanticism of the metaphors, because they're compelling, they're exuberant, they're exciting, even for us who live alongside those daily, but that we must use our critical lenses. Worldwide, the idea of embracing these indigenous ontologies and philosophies, but yet at the same time paradoxically coexisting in a neoliberal and capitalist world. Our contribution as SAP scholars is around these very tensions, and as I said, how my world changed when I had to move and could move beyond the economic view. And at the end of the day, I think what Ubuntu says all over those countries of Africa is that I am because you are, we coexist. I enter Europe, just as an example, you enter Africa, and we find these meeting points. And perhaps it lies in the following exposition, which I definitely won't go into, but I will leave it as the closing idea, dealing with ontological pluralism and calling upon this paper, which incidentally and interestingly enough, starts off as a defense of the so-called pure or biological ontology and ends up with an argument about the kinds of ontology that we as South Africans and as strategy as practice scholars with whom I'm privileged to be with this afternoon find ourselves very much at home in. So from an African point of view, Ngiyabonga, Nkosi kakhulu, and then thank you, Dankie, Baya Dankie, and thank you, Melina, for managing time, and to all of you for your audience this afternoon. I'll stop sharing.